Welcome back to the Female Dating Strategy, the meanest female only podcast on the internet. I'm your host, Diana.
And I'm Rose. And today, Diana and I continue to have another phenomenal guest that we're very excited to host, Amber Akilla. Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Amber, I'm really excited to learn more about you. I think learn more about you because Diana is the one who's really sort of the Amber Akilla expert. Wouldn't you say, Diana?
I don't know that I would call myself an expert, but I'm definitely familiar with Amber Akilla's work from TikTok and from YouTube. And I just thought that she would be a person that is very aligned with the sort of messaging that we have. And just that, the women that are listening to us, they're always looking for other women to listen to. And I've been listening to you for a really long time. And I just think that, in general, you've had a very decentered approach to men. You've prioritized female friendships. You've prioritized radical self-acceptance. And I think that these are things that our audience is looking for as well. And I just thought that, this is a really great fit because at the end of the day, I love introducing our audience to new women that they can also learn from. I remember really early on when the Reddit was out there, I don't know if it was a comment or if it was like on one of the main pages, but I remember someone said, you don't have to agree with 100% of what all the women say here. Like, if you can take away 95% of that and it's useful to you, and the 5% you disregard, that's still fine. And I think that we've lost the ability to have nuance and to critically think and to assume that we have to agree 100% with everyone's politics. I think that's a big part of the reason we live in such a polarizing environment now. Like, I don't go into every interaction with people expecting I'm going to agree with everything they have to say. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Amber as well. I think that she also approaches thinking from that perspective. She just like, everybody needs a good dose of critical thinking, and who better to call it than Amber Akilla?
Amber, in the pre-show we were discussing, as we normally do, we discuss like our outline. And one of the things when we were talking at first is I was like, well, Amber Akilla, tell me all about you. And you did. You started with a bit of your life journey. And I was wondering if you would be willing to just introduce our audience to more about you in that regard.
Okay, so I am ethnically Chinese, but I grew up in Western Australia in a very small city in white suburbia. So my mom was a single mom working, and she was like the sole provider as well. And I think that had a really big impact on the way that I see like a woman's role in society and the responsibility and sacrifice that women and mothers make for their children and their family as well. So I also went to an all-girls school. Like, I basically grew up in Barbie land, essentially. Like, when I watched the Barbie movie, I was like, oh, that's kind of how I grew up. Like, just surrounded by women, Kens and men in the background.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
With your mother, so she was an immigrant
Mm-hmm.
to Australia, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you said she had immigrated when she was just like a teenager, basically?
Yeah, like 19, 20 years old in the 80s.
Okay. A young woman in the 80s landing on the shores of Australia. Are you an only child?
Yeah, I grew up as an only child.
Okay. And then with the all-girls school that you went to, was that a public or private? Was it a religious, like a Catholic school?
It was a private school, but Anglican. And my mom actually said that she intentionally didn't send me to a Catholic school. And maybe she had some like associations with Catholicism and didn't want me to be in like a really strict religious environment. And yeah, I think like we didn't have a really strong like religious agenda in our school. It was just like church or like chapel every other week. And our priest would occasionally give us like ethics and religion classes. But yeah, it wasn't like we were praising God and Jesus every day or anything.
So would you call it more like a sort of liberal, secular upbringing?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. And I think that our teachers provided like a very diverse sort of like, they were able to present a diverse set of ideas to us. And obviously, if you're going to a private school, like most of the parents or the families are going to be more liberal minded, but the teachers are going to be more like left leaning. So they were still, like critical thinking was highly encouraged and taught. So that had a really big impact on the way that I interact with information and see the world. And then also because I was like really into visual art and music, my English teachers had a really huge impact on the media that I referenced and consumed for my projects. And then even though like our music director was a man, he was still like always very supportive and encouraging of me as well. So I think that I was just really lucky to be in that kind of environment. Yeah, in my formative years.
Yeah, I come from a very Catholic background. And so when I hear that your mom was like, I'm not going to send you, specifically, I'm not sending you to a Catholic school, I applaud her good sense, especially considering like the history of the church with women is just so abysmal. I feel like she really made the right call with that. But it's so interesting to hear you talk about this. You didn't just discuss, but you were taught, you were trained in critical thinking because, this is something that literally has never been taught in the United States that I know of. Like, it's certainly never been on any public school agenda, never. And I didn't even realize that until when I was living in South America. I became really good friends with a whole bunch of philosophers, and some of them were for philosophy teachers. And in Chile, they start teaching philosophy in 6th grade, like when the kids are like 11 or 12. And the whole idea is like to learn about morals and ethics, logic and reason, and critical thinking. And they start that while they're still preteens.
Mm. Yeah, that's amazing.
It was amazing. And I was like, well, no wonder if I've been feeling like I'm missing out on something. And I went then to a liberal arts college and I got my degrees in the humanities, and still that was still not something that was very common. And I just think oftentimes when people are like, what's going on in the States? It's like, we are explicitly not taught to think critically.
Yeah, like whenever we studied media in school, it was always like question everything and like how do you justify your point of view in an essay. When I was studying art, the way that the curriculum was structured and the way that we were told to structure our writing about art was to understand like the context that a piece of work lives in and also the artist's context and how does that differ to the audience's context and what are the political and cultural influences that would affect an artist's like process and the way that the art is consumed. So that's actually had like a really big impact on the way that I also create content or the way that I come to not necessarily conclusions because I think it's a continuous exploration, but I read a lot about like political history and then I think about how political dynamics affect personal dynamics and there's always parallels because what exists on the micro then extends into the macro. I still talk about this with my friends I went to school with. We had a climate skeptic, one of those really famous climate skeptics, give us a talk at our school. Like, we're in Western Australia in the middle of nowhere. And this like British, like Lord something, he came and he gave us this talk about climate change and like trying to debunk climate change, basically. And I remember I was probably like 15 at the time. And I was sitting in this talk and I was like, why am I here? Like, why is this guy talking to us? Because it's like so antithetical to everything else that I've been learning in class. And then after that talk, I remember I think I had like geography class and English class that day. And both of those teachers were like, okay, so you guys received a talk today from this climate skeptic. Let's unpack his argument. Yeah. And like try to verify or debunk what he's saying to you. I think it was when I finished high school, I was listening to like independent radio in the car. And then there was a talk about like the mining industry in Australia because mining is like a huge industry, especially in the state that I grew up in. And talking about one of the billionaires from our state and how she had paid for a climate skeptic to talk at her high school that she went to at her alma mater. And I was like, wait, I was at that talk. Like,
Oh my gosh, now it all becomes clear, huh? Mm-hmm.
you hear about, the collaboration between like the private sector, the public sector, propaganda, how corporate interests like infiltrate education. And that was like the clearest example. Like even in suburban Western Australia, like that was happening, the way that corporate interests can infiltrate, the minds of the youth and try to influence, future like entrepreneurs and women. Yeah.
That's a really great point because I think that corporate interests do have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo as well. That's why they have a lot of like this birth rate doomerism essentially going on in the world. Like it's like a big catastrophe if women don't continue to sleep with men. And like I think that these like dating companies, these dating apps and stuff, they have a vested interest in keeping people settling for shitty relationships. I think that billionaires do have a vested interest in making sure that women don't have agency and things like that. And I'm kind of curious to, I know you said you had your feminist awakening really young. Like, how has that affected your relationships with other women? And like, seeing as you always had this kind of different perspective, I'm pretty certain you probably felt like an outlier a lot of the times. Like, how did you deal with that growing up and like, now entering the stage of life that you're in?
Well, I think that like it's been hard at times for sure, but at the same time, like I just kind of try to keep it moving as well. Or I think I've always had other things that I want to work on for myself that have just kept me sort of like redirecting back to what I want to do. Like, okay, so I talked about how I grew up in like Barbie land, but then when I started interacting and socializing with men at university and when I started DJing, especially, like back then, there were not many female household DJ names. And even still, it's like kind of a niche.
I don't think that's changed much.
Exactly. But that was like still, like even back then, that was like the very beginning of sort of like the big EDM wave and then DJing becoming like a actual like I don't know, like position that you can hold as a artist and performer. It wasn't really like as mainstream as it is now, I would say. So you can imagine like being in an isolated city in Australia. It was very white, male dominated. And yeah, just like the misogyny and racism that I experienced in that environment. I mean, granted, there was still like good moments, etc. I'm grateful for the people that supported me, but it was still kind of like a war zone. And I think that it was weird because then I started questioning my ability. Up until that point, I never thought I wouldn't be able to DJ because I was Asian or because I was a woman. I just thought I want to do this, so I'm going to. And then when I started doing it, I was getting all this pushback and I was like, well, why wouldn't I be able to do this? Like, I don't think I'm worse than any of the other men that I'm on a lineup with. In fact, I think I'm better than a lot of them. And then I sort of like went through a period of like really intense self doubt, like also recondition or like uncondition myself from back to the sort of mentality that I had when I was younger. But yeah, there's definitely been periods where I've sort of assumed that people around me are on the same page because they can sort of mirror back what I'm saying in order to like facilitate a connection or a relationship. And then, enough time passes and I've just been consistent with who I am. And like they are revealed to have like a very different value system to me, actually. Like it's just kind of like a surface level engagement with the things that are like deep in my core. But yeah, I think I've always had like this desire to move forward or explore more or see what else I can achieve, see what else I can create, see what else I can connect with or who else I can connect with. That even though there have been like really devastating like friend breakups or relationships or like traumatic situations that I've been in, I'm just like, okay, well, I'm just going to do something else. Like there has to be something else that I can do. And I think the more you persevere in service of like being hot and having fun, when I eventually found the words for it, you realize that, yeah, that's all you can really do. Those are all different sorts of challenges that can deepen your connection to yourself, actually, if you take that opportunity and to like widen your perspective, deepen your understanding, and it puts you in a better position for whatever the next connection or experience or opportunities that you're going to have are. Because I always try to tell my listeners, like, because a lot of them are still really young or at least younger than me, I'm like, sometimes you just haven't been alive long enough to know how your life can change in ways that you could never predict for, or how your life could be better than the situation that you're currently in. Like when you're young, you literally just haven't had enough experience. There hasn't been enough time that's passed for you to contextualize this relationship and its breakdown relative to your other life experience. But once you've experienced a few friend breakups or romantic relationship breakups, you're like, okay, it's actually not going to define me the way that it feels like it will in the moment. So I think that having dealt with a lot of like anxiety and depression, I think that reminding yourself that it's worth just seeing what happens next, you know? Like you don't have to know exactly what it is, but just being open to the fact that it could be better, you know? It could be worse too, but you'll be okay regardless.
I want to get into the philosophy behind being hot and having fun, but I do also want to talk a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to say, how did you get to that? Like, how did you get to being hot and having fun? Like, that's such a pithy phrase, and I love what that implies. Would you break it down for us, like how that sort of came to fruition for you?
But before we get into that, I also want to talk a little bit about motherhood because we had such an interesting discussion about motherhood in the pre-talk. And I wonder, I mean, it seems like your mom was the OG when it came to this philosophy, really, because she moved to a foreign country when she was really young and she did it on her own. She raised it on her own. And I think that growing up with a person that has that much strength must have had some kind of profound impact on you. And like, I want to know, how did that, affect your goals? And like, all of us have such unique relationships with our mothers. And I think it also sets the stage for what we accept and tolerate in relationships. So, I mean, I would love to hear a little bit about that. And then, obviously we can get into, being chaotic and critical thinking and being hot and having fun, but just wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, my mom is the OG baddie, in my opinion. I think that I definitely took for granted, like, the impact of being around somebody like that and being raised by someone like my mother. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that not everyone has been in the same situation as me, you know. And I said in the pre-talk as well, like I'm definitely empathetic to people who didn't grow up in that environment and how that's affected how male-centered their life might be, or how their perception of themselves as a woman and women in general is influenced by that. But yeah, my mom, I think also, I talk about like the difference in our sort of like core personalities. My mom is just naturally very self assured and confident. And my grandma is like almost a narcissist. So for her to have the outlook on life that she does, given the environment that she grew up in, I think is like incredibly radical. And yeah, she just always said, like, ever since I was young, I just always felt like I was better than everyone. Like, that's my mom's. She was like, I don't know why you would ever question like who you are or like whether or not you're attractive. Like, why would you ever question that? She was like, there was no indication that I was ever like less than. Even when people tried to tell me that I was, I would never believe that, you know? So that's just like, some people are just born that way, you know? And I think that for me, I definitely did not have that disposition when I was younger, because she would say, like, oh, you were like so small, you were the youngest in the class, like they tried to hold you back in pre-primary because you were asleep for the whole thing, but I pushed you to move into year one. I didn't think you were going to make it, like you would cry over everything, blah blah blah. Like she was like, I was so worried about you. So like I didn't have like the same level of self-assuredness that my mom just naturally has. Like I talk about how like you can be born with it, but you can also build it, you know, like through the experiences that I've had, through the example that she set for me. It's like an ongoing process. And it's not like I'm completely free of insecurities or anything, or my mom doesn't have insecurities or doubts as well, but we just sort of deal with them very differently. And I think because I've built my sort of like self-confidence now that I'm an adult, I give my mom like advice and perspective on like what she's doing, because she's like, yeah, I've never questioned this before. And now I feel like there's like a process to how she's thinking or like moving into the next stage of her life. But being raised by her in the environment that I was, it was a really stark contrast. And or I really got an example of like the sacrifices that mothers make for their children, for their family, and the challenges that come with being a woman, especially in that time, providing for your daughter, balancing a demanding career with having a child in an environment that expects you to just sacrifice everything to be like a full-time mother. So
Wow.
I think also for her, she just talks about how like she just didn't have time to even think about what people thought of her as a Chinese woman or as a single mother. She was like, I had shit to do, you know? And for me, because she was like, when I was experiencing racism, she was like, what are you talking about? Like, you're so lucky. to even go to the school that you go to, or like, why do you want friends, Amber? I was like, what?
I kind of understand where she comes from because I think
Yeah.
there's a really big cultural shift between first generation immigrants and like second gen. I mean, I was a first generation immigrant too, and I was like in a very similar position of like, I don't really have time to worry about how colonialism is affecting me right now. I need to feed myself. And I completely understand that generation for that as well. But I do think that, even if you're born with it, I think that there is some value in building it brick by brick because I mean, I can say that I'm probably close to saying that I was born with it. I had a very supportive environment and I never really thought that there was anything wrong with me, but it's very easy to lose as well because when it's being propped up by a parent, if you lose that parent or if your environment changes and you're not used to having that level of pushback in your life, it's very easy to slip from being self assured to not as self assured. And I think that people have to accept that they go through phases as well. I mean, we all have insecurities, but there are times in your life when things are just harder and you might not be nearly as confident as you were. But that's why I think there's more value in building it brick by brick because you've been able to weather the storm. And I think that when you're able to do that, you just wind up with a stronger sense of self. It's so interesting that your mom and your journey like parallels each other because your mom left China to move to Australia and you left Australia to move back to China. So in some ways, that's like a homecoming.
Yes. When I first wanted to move to China, she was like, why? I brought you here. Like, but now understood in time, she was like, okay, yeah, there's definitely more opportunity for you in China. It makes sense. And she also did come to understand how different it was for us. Like her moving to Australia and me growing up there, she was like, yeah, when I moved to Australia, like you said, I was like focused on survival. I didn't think about like being Chinese, but for you growing up around white people, it's very different. You want to fit in. And yeah, like this desire to be sort of included or like to feel included or part of a community is like really important. Whereas for my mom, she was already like spent her childhood in China and there was no doubt about her Chinese identity. But then similar to when I moved back to China in 2022, I was like coming from Australia 2 years of on and off lockdown and like not much going on in like my physical surroundings. So I was just like so single minded in coming back and like figuring out how to get shit done that only in the last like 6 months I've been reflecting more on it and like the different challenges that came with it. And when I describe certain things to my friends, like have met more recently, they're like, what the hell? Like, that's traumatic what you went through. But again, like I was just so focused on like what I needed to do that you go through different phases, when you are really single minded and then your awareness can diffuse after you feel like you've built like a foundation for yourself. And I also think like speaking to the being born with confidence and building your confidence, I try to tell my audience, like, even if someone looks like they're having it really easy now, it doesn't mean that it's easy forever. And it's not because you're preying on people's downfall, but it's like recognizing your own humanity. Just because you're having a hard time now doesn't mean that it won't be in service of you having a better time. Like everybody, I do feel like everything kind of balances out in the end. So just sort of embracing each phase of your life with as much awareness and intention as you can and not getting too caught up in comparing yourself with other people, because it's human nature to just convince yourself that your situation is good or like it is better than it actually is. And you might not realize until way after that you were completely deluded or you were being manipulated. So don't just think that because someone is telling you my life is amazing right now, this relationship is totally great, that is necessarily the case. You don't have to do anything about it, but you just have to remember that only you can experience your experience and only they can experience their experience. So you're sharing information, but it's not like, nothing is really like written in stone at the end of the day.
Amber, I feel like you have like the wisdom of like a Buddhist monk.
Actually, it's so funny because we interviewed Felixie a couple of weeks ago and she was like, oh, she's like a philosopher.
Yeah, exactly. These are sort of the conversations I would have with my philosopher friends in Chile. And that's why it was such an important epoch of my life, because these were things expressed that I had never heard before, especially coming from a very Catholic, very US American religion type environment. I think you're so right, especially helping younger people understand that like nothing is permanent. This sense that whatever you're going through right now, it's always going to be like that. The only assurance you have is that it will change. Change is the only constant, right? I was going to say just learning how to reorient and learning how to sort of recalibrate is so important to one's emotional health.
And I will say that people do a lot in service of an image, especially with the way that social media has grown. I think a lot of people think, like, I mean, the fear of missing out and like the desire to have community, I think these are two really strong reasons that women stay trapped in relationships that are honestly beneath them. Because I think that they look at things on social media and they're like, well, this person is projecting a really picture perfect life. And in some ways, I feel behind. And so that, I think that's really human to just want to belong, to fit in with everyone. And I think that if you're in an environment where everyone prioritizes that kind of connection, you're just going to feel left behind inevitably. We say this on the podcast all the time. It's easier said than done to decenter men because your entire life has been the opposite of that. And to like go through the unraveling, the conditioning, it takes years for some people. But I also think about the really funny fact that your mom was like, you'd be surprised how many people get married just for the money. And it's true. And it's like, I think people think that every single relationship they see around them is this like picture perfect romantic comedy where they're being super valued. I mean, of course, it could be. We don't know, right? But I think that people set too much store by what they observe in other people and set that as the benchmark for how they should live their own life. And, I do think that even in that regard, detachment becomes really important. Understanding that, somebody else's good outcome doesn't mean that you're doomed to a life of failure, not
Right.
internalizing other people's success as your own personal failure. I think that that's been like a big thing for me as well over time. Also, because I live in a society where people compare a lot. Like, it's kind of a very South Asian thing to be like, oh, yeah, compare my kid to this person's kid and how well is this kid doing? So, like, it's always like you're in competition with other people about milestones. If it's not for like school or grades, then it becomes about jobs and partners or kids. And then, then you have children and it becomes about your kids are competing with other people now. And so it's like the cycle never really ends. And I think somewhere it's with us to actually stop and be like, listen, like, do I want these things because I want them? I think in the pandemic, a lot of women woke up to that reality because I certainly did, where I was like, do I want these things because I want them? Or do I want them because everybody around me told me that I won't want them? And because society has mandated that.
And my question then becomes, Amber, like when you decided I'm going to go to China and I'm going to like enter my be hot, have fun era, like how did that mentality or how did that shift into that mentality come about?
So I think being stuck in Australia during the pandemic when I wanted to be in Shanghai, that was like a really overwhelming experience. And I've went into my like Saturn return, emotional, spiritual rock bottom, existential crisis. And I think I remember when I was young, I was reading like some meditation or like Buddhism book or something, like when I was a teenager. And I remember thinking, like, okay, no matter what happens, like you deserve to be happy, or like you'll have to figure out a way to be happy, even when it feels like too overwhelming. Like I sort of carried that sentiment with me as a teenager, I guess. And by the time I was in my like mid to late 20s being stuck in Australia, I felt very defined by not being able to be in Shanghai for the first like few months that I was there. And I still very much held on to the hope that I would just be able to get a visa and I'd be able to be back in Shanghai within a few months. Okay, then more months passed and I was like, cool, this doesn't seem as likely as I initially thought. And at first I felt like it was my fault. I remember seeing my therapist and being like, I don't know, I feel like it's my fault that I can't like live the life that I had in Shanghai before. And she was like, but it's not your fault. Like it's completely out of your control. Why would you think that she was like, you're in Perth, look around you. Like you're not in Shanghai. So there's no reason why your life should look like that, and it's a global pandemic. It's not your fault. I was like, okay, cool.
I wondered if you had a therapist because it sounds like you've got some real therapy, like truths that you've absorbed.
Right. Yeah. There was definitely like two major takeaways I had from my time at therapy, which was like underneath all of the things that other people think that you should do, like what is it that you want? And I was like, I want to go back to Shanghai because there was like a period where I thought, should I move to Melbourne? Should I move to Sydney? People there are telling me to go there. Like on paper, it felt like it would make sense for me to do that, but I just don't want to. I just want to wait until I can go back to Shanghai. And she was like, yeah, so like that's what you can do. You don't have to do these things that other people say that you should do. I was like, oh, okay. But yeah, I think one day I just woke up and I was like, cool, being depressed is like not chic.
Yeah.
And this is like I was like, who wants to hear about me being sad every day? Like, even I'm sick of myself, you know? Like, I always talk about like, think about what you're contributing to the vibe as well, because that, I think, especially for like Western hyper individualistic cultures, it's always like my feelings are superior, or my feelings take priority over how everyone else is feeling. But you might be making other people feel shit in the process of you not dealing with your shit too. So I was like, okay, well, it's still important for me to have like a positive contribution to the world around me, even if it is very minor. And I think me posting about how I'm sad every day is like really lame. So I have to do something about this. And then I think it started with like, I was not born to be ugly or have a bad time, you know? I was just like, I was not born to be ugly or have a bad time, like whenever I was sad. And then I made a podcast episode about that. But after I recorded it, I was like, you know what? I need to like rework this into like a more positive and affirming
Yes.
saying. So that I reworked it into, okay, I was born to be hot and have fun. And then like that's sort of like how the philosophy was born.
It's funny because when you're on the precipice of great change is when you're tired of your own bullshit. I think I've said this on the podcast. I was like, when you get sick of your own shit is when you're actually going to change.
Right, right. And I've spoken to people that have been going through a really hard time, and it's just this like constant negative feedback loop. And I've been like, you know, you just have to get sick of yourself, and you have to get sick of being this way. And they don't understand it because they're so deeply entrenched in the narrative that they constantly reinforce to themselves. I'm like, look around you. It's not as bad as your mind is like tricking you into thinking that it is. So that's why, you know, I always talk about having a hobby that allows you to get into your body, or like having relationships or just practices that can ground you even when things get tough. You know, those practices don't guarantee that it'll be easy forever, but that if it does get hard, you have something that can pull you out of it so that you can like regain perspective or like just recalibrate how you see things, because it's only natural for your mind to try to like pull you, you know, being hot and having fun.
I was thinking about how like 10,000 monkeys is one of the ways that like, you know, in Hinduism, they'll be like, part of the reason you meditate is to quiet the 10,000 monkeys that is your brain, right? The fact that your brain can never just calm down and shut the fuck up, like it's its own animal. And we have to learn ways in which like it will trick us, it will lie to us, it will distort things. We have to learn how to manage those. And one of the things I remember, I had to become sober, Amber. I'm just somebody who's like, I'm such a hedonist. I just, you know, I'm like a typical American who just like is gluttonous and whatnot. And it was during COVID that I was like, oh, this is really becoming a problem. And also because my mother had died. And so like things just kind of snowballed after that. So that's when I started my journey to sobriety. And one of the things that is often mentioned in sobriety is like, you have to get to the point where you're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so I think this is what we keep coming back to. It's like everybody's responsible for their own destiny. But like if we combine our forces and we work on being hot and having fun, like what kind of different world can we create together?
And I think that, you know, it's also a good idea to laugh at yourself and not take yourself so seriously. Like, I think I got to bypass some of my angsty teenage years, but then what ended up happening is they started like manifesting real hard during my Saturn return. And I realized, oh, I had it easy because that was probably the worst I've ever had it. And that's why all my angsty teenage shit started coming out then. And then I started laughing because I was like, this is not that deep. I don't know why I'm so upset about this, because a lot of the fears I had before that, like those fears came to pass. And I was like, oh, actually, I'm still alive. I'm still here. I still live in a beautiful place. I have the privilege of working in the field that I set out to work in. Like, I work in a very, very promising industry. I have a promising career. I did all the things I said that I would do that I thought that I wouldn't do when I was 18. Like, all the things that were just like random thoughts, like I made them real. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting over here whining because one thing is not the way I want it to be, or two things are not the way I want it to be. And I was like, okay, this is a teenage temper tantrum. That's what's happening. I mean, I didn't have it in my teens. I'm having it now, right? Working through that emotion, I think, is really important. You know, accepting that it is what it is, that you're feeling that way, and not repressing it is so important. And also, I think people get caught up in positivity culture, and they're like, oh, just good vibes only, and like, don't ever acknowledge the dark, you know? And I'm like, well, you kind of do need to make peace with your demons if you're going to actually move past that, you know? And I do think that there's some value in balance.
Yes. And I think in the end, like the time that I had during the pandemic, even though at the time or at first, I was like, why is this happening? This is the worst thing ever. Like all the projects I had lined up for 2020, I wasn't able to do. I would still get asked if I was available to work, which was in one way flattering, but in another way frustrating because I was like, well, I can't because I'm not there. But when I eventually moved back to Shanghai, now I look back on that time and I'm so grateful for that time that I had because I connected with my mom more as well. Like my mom and I had lived pretty separate lives up until that point. It was like the longest time that I'd spent consistently with my mom during the pandemic in a long time. And both of us went through a lot in that period. So we were able to be there for each other. And I think we were able to build a connection and a relationship as like adults as well. And still mother daughter, but also like almost as equals in a way. And with all the time that I had and just like the lack of sensory stimulation being out in the suburbs during lockdown, I was able to really focus on having practices that would ground me and help me to like work through all the trauma that I was running away from when I first moved to Shanghai. And then when I came back to Shanghai, those practices continued to ground me during the chaos of like coming back to a place that had just come out of a lockdown as well, but like a lot of people, a lot of socializing. I had way more social contact in like a week of being back in Shanghai than I had in like 6 months in Australia. And also figuring out like what I wanted to do or what I could do, I needed to continue those grounding practices. And I probably wouldn't have developed them to the level that I had if I had just been in Shanghai at the time. And like, who knows what direction my life would have taken if I hadn't had that space as well. Because then I saw a lot of people who didn't really reconcile, didn't take the opportunity to deal with things that they'd been running away from pre-pandemic, during the pandemic or whatever. And it really did affect like our relationship and also the trajectory that they're on as well. So, yeah, like that was a perfect example of how my perspective of something shifted so radically just with time and trying to be intentional with the time in spite of how difficult it felt or how it didn't seem like it was going the way that I wanted it to go. And then also like having a sense of humor about the entitlement for everything to go your way. Like that's such a
Mm-hmm.
delusional way of
Mm-hmm.
thinking.
So delusional, but yet we all fall prey.
Yeah. That's why sometimes I'm like, I haven't fully embraced like the delusional discourse because I think that it's about, you know, everything will go my way, but not in the way that I anticipate. And like embracing that journey is important because that's also what makes an interesting story. You know, if I moved to Shanghai in 2017 and then all my problems were solved and everything just went well, I would have nothing to say today, you know? So that whole push, pull, hero's journey, whatever, is such an important part of the human experience. So yeah, just like embracing it for the plot rather than being chaotic for the plot, I think is also like a helpful mindset shift when things start to go a little left.
It's really interesting that you bring up the hero's journey because it's like a tool that we use in screenwriting a lot. But one of the most fundamental things about it is that you need to have conflict to make a character interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like a character's really boring if nothing ever happens to them, you know? The delusional thing, I think it only really works if you're a person who's constantly an overthinker and don't do anything. If delusion moves you to act, that's probably the only time it's actually helpful for you. I also agree with the idea that, like, you know, there's some things you can't be delusional about. There are some things you do need to be a little bit grounded about. But also, I think that you need to be open to what life is trying to teach you. I think if the assumption is like I'm entitled to everything because I feel like I deserve it in some way, as opposed to I want to be accepting of what life could give me. You know, I think you're missing a lot of the blessings that you're supposed to have. Like I think a lot of people try to force a situation that doesn't necessarily bring them joy just because. I mean, again, it's all about timelines, right? I think a lot of people are like, okay, I'm in my late 20s, my early 30s. I should get married. I should do these things. I should get married. I should have kids. Like, it's a lot of I should as opposed to do I want to? You know, is this the right time for me? And people settle for really bad situations because they don't have the ability to actually determine what is good for them, what is healthy for them or not. And I think a lot of that has to be like, you have to let go of a degree of control in your life and assume that it's all going to look the way you need it to. There needs to be this ability to let go of control. And I think a lot of people, when they don't feel like they can control everything, they get anxious and they're like, no, now I'm going to start spiraling into scarcity mindset. if I don't do it now, it will never happen. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people get really siloed into these thought patterns that are very negative just because their lives don't mirror a life that they saw on social media or their friends' lives or whatever, you know?
Yeah, and I think like I am not super well versed on like manifestation theory, but my understanding of it is it's like focusing on the emotion that you want to feel or like the state that you want to be in. And when you sort of open your mind to like the possibilities of like how you can live or the experience that you can have, you realize that there are actually so many different ways to get into the state that you desire that aren't just if I meet societal expectations, you know? And also the things that you want to do, just because you want it and you didn't get it this time doesn't mean it's not possible for you at a later date. Like I experienced that so much with work opportunities. Like sometimes this opportunity comes and maybe I don't get it and I feel like, oh my God, I've cooked it. Like I'm never going to be able to do it. And then in the end, all these things happen that I could never like draw a path out for. Like, oh, I'm going to meet this person and then do this and then do this and then I'm going to get it. It's like I still got the opportunity and it actually came to me in an even better form than I initially imagined. And it's just because I let go of needing everything to go the way that I projected that it had to. And like the feeling that I get, especially when it comes to like validation, because I talk about that a lot when it comes to decentering men, learning to cultivate other forms of validation, whether that's self-validation, validation in your work, validation in your contribution to community, validation in your friendships, in your family, versus just validation for being desirable to a man, like validation for your appearance. Like there are so many different types of validation. And when you explore like the path to those things, you realize that there are so many ways to feel fulfilled in your life as a person and as a woman that have nothing to do with being desirable to men.
Yeah.
Here, here.
Here, yeah. You know what? I'm kind of curious to know what your philosophy is just with decentering men in general and standing your ground, especially like the cute, chaotic, and critical thinking. Like, how did you come up with that?
So I think for cute, chaotic, and critical thinking, like I do try to acknowledge that there is like a shadow self, and it's not about repressing the part of you that seems undesirable or seems problematic to whatever like echo chamber you live in, because I think especially for like Western media landscape and like narrative, it is very focused on like being quote unquote good, and it is like a human desire to see yourself as a good person and to be seen as a good person. But when you can reconcile like the light and the dark and the desirable undesirable parts of yourself and embrace it, but then also be intentional with how you express it, I think that you can just have like a more integrated sort of like experience. So that's why it's like cute, chaotic, and critical, because you are going to have times where you want to crash out or where you really have hatred for a person or a thing, or you want to like seek revenge, or you feel the urge to be toxic. But there's also parts of you that, you know, are cute, are loving, nurturing, want to be kind, generous, compassionate, but also critical in the sense that you are discerning between like which parts of you prioritize, accepting that you can have like dark thoughts and dark emotions, but your character will be determined by how you behave, right? And I think that thought policing, like cancel culture, makes it seem like you're not allowed to have any dark parts of yourself, or it's people who haven't reconciled with their own darkness that are denying the existence in other people or denying other people like the space to have been that, you know, and like the question of like self accountability and responsibility and stuff. So that's like cute, chaotic, and critical thinking. And then like with decentering men, I think that it is very much a journey in the same way that a lot of people's journey and development, like through feminist ideas, is not necessarily going to be perfect. Like nobody is a perfect feminist, and decentering men is not about hating men at the same way that feminism isn't about siloing men either. You know, I think that true feminism is seeking like collaboration between the genders or the sexes rather than one over the other. You know, like one over the other is a patriarchal sort of like imperialist colonizer white supremacist mindset that there is a winner and a loser. And I think that feminism, socialism, and decentering men for me is more about being able to like sort of create a more egalitarian way of approaching your relationships and your life in general, I think. And it's not one or the other as well. It can be a combination of both. Like I live in China and it's like socialism with Chinese characteristics. The way that people live or the way that society is structured is not capitalism or socialism. It's like a combination of both that works for where the country is at now, you know, and they constantly develop and refine how they govern society. And it's not a perfect system because there is no perfect system. But I think that it's brought a lot of positive development for the country. And of course, you know, there are consequences that come with it too. But again, I think like the way that the West talks about China is similar to the way that men talk about women, or the way that people that aren't feminists talk about feminism.
Oh, they're crashing out.
Yeah.
Damn.
China is in its hot girl era and the Western countries are crashing.
Yeah, so I see a lot of parallels, you know, between my personal experience as a Chinese person, like growing up, people being like, you're weird, you're ugly, whatever, like your culture is weird. And now it's like, Amber, I want to come to China, like blah, 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 it looks so cool. And I think that back to like the decentering men thing, I think back to the decentering men part, I think that it's normal when you first sort of like realize or you start to see the reality of society, of history, to be like, I fucking hate men. Like, what the hell? Why has it been this way? You know, like I definitely had that phase too where I was just like, this doesn't make any sense.
You get disillusioned, right?
And you're angry, and you're rightfully so. Like, why has this been going on for so long? And then you sort of get to a point of, for me, realizing that, you know, the opposite of love isn't hate. It's like apathy and indifference. And for me, I don't hate men. You know, I hate the system that has created the society that we live in, where women are being marginalized. There's so much violence against women. There's the denial of the female experience, of like women's labor, of women's contribution, of women's voices and experience. But on a person to person level, I'm just like generally indifferent to men, unless they can show me that they treat me with the respect that I would grant them just as a person, you know? Like, it's like when I was younger, growing up Chinese in a white environment, I never thought to treat a white person differently because they were white. To me, they were just a person. And my question was never, why aren't I white? Can I be white? It was just, why do white people think that they can treat me as less than just because I'm Asian? Because I would never do that to them, you know? And I had the same question with men. Like, why do men think they can treat me as less than when I just treat them like a person, you know? So for me, it's like, okay, are we meeting as equals? Are we meeting from a place of mutual support and respect, regardless of your gender? Those are the relationships and the connections that I will prioritize. And whenever relationships like that don't carry that energy anymore, then I have to reassess, you know, and that goes for people of any gender and in any context. Like, I've had to cut members of my family out, friends, work, etc. So I try to maintain like integrity and consistency in all contexts. Because I think another thing with like the romance industrial complex, especially for women, is like, oh, your relationships with men and your romantic relationships run with a different set of rules to all the other relationships in your life, you know? But actually, why would they? Because like your relationship with a man or your romantic relationship is the most intimate relationship that you can have, separate to maybe your family, just from like a sort of like societal perspective. So why should you be any less stringent or discerning with who gets to assume that role in your life than who you work with or who you're friends with? And I think like the saddest relationship dynamic to observe is like a woman that will kind of isolate herself from her community, from her friends and from her family in service of a relationship with a man who treats her worse than her friends and family, you know? So I think that like decentering men is not like hating men, but I think a lot of women have subconsciously placed their relationships with men and the validation of men on a pedestal. So it's just like placing men in an equal position to everybody else that you deal with. Because why is a man who's doing less than the bare minimum being given so much of your time and energy relative to the people who actually have your best interests at heart? You know, a man who literally wouldn't care if you lived or died sees you as replaceable is like being given your time and your energy in ways that your other relationships aren't. And that's not to say that everyone's relationship with men is that way, but it's just like coming from this patriarchal culture and history. That's like the pain point for a lot of women. They're like, why won't this man change for me?
Yeah. I don't think it's about like just decentering men either, because people assume that then you just live in a vacuum. It's about centering yourself. Like, we're not saying decenter them to the point of like, not having anything else going on for you. I think a lot of women are just not used to centering themselves. They're not used to thinking about, well, like what serves me, what makes me happy. I mean, if you come from the perspective of like, I am innately valuable and I pour a lot into my connections because I know that I do, like I know how I operate in friendships, I know how I operate with my family. And there's a lot I put in. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that somebody who's supposed to be my most intimate connection pours into me as well. Otherwise, what's the point? Like, I mean, a lot of people have extremely intimate connections with men that are actually very superficial compared to the relationships they have with other women. They still rely on their friends and they still rely on their family to pick up the slack of this guy who's not doing that much. And yeah, I do think that there's some benefit to decentering them. And I agree with the thing about being apathetic to them. Like, that's the thing. I think a lot of people have the assumption that FDS is a space that hates men. In all honesty, we tell women to prioritize their own individual lives. Like, it's actually a good idea to be apathetic or indifferent to someone who's determined to oppress you, honestly. I mean, again, we don't assume that every man is coming in with that intention, but if somebody is going to get into an argument with me not in good faith, right, trying to misunderstand me intentionally, I'm not going to waste precious time trying to prove a point to them because they've already come into the conversation determined to misunderstand me.
Yeah, and I think that in spite of growing up in like a Barbie land environment relative to maybe most people's experience, like a lot of the men that I encountered treated me very well. Like even in my romantic relationships, I think I've been treated pretty well by men. It's just at the breakdown of the relationship, it's like, okay, I'm not going to tolerate this because I know what you're capable of. So why would I allow you to lower the bar for me if I haven't lowered like the way that I approach this? And also it's just like compatibility issues, whatever. So because I am treated well by men, I'm like, why would you tolerate poor treatment from men? Like it would never cross my mind to allow a man to siphon energy from me if there are men who like understand what I'm about and, we respect and support each other. And it doesn't have to go into this like weird toxic territory. But that's also like understanding your power as a woman, that you are the person that gets to determine how other people treat you. And that's every person, because I even have men and like guys who have listened to my podcast or have tuned into my TikTok lives or whatever. And they say that they've learnt a lot from my point of view as well. So I think that my content is generally like gender neutral. Like anybody can take something from it. It can be.
I was going to say, Amber, to me, you sound like a humanist.
Yeah.
Right. And I really wish we could head more in that direction, especially men. Like, okay, if feminism is such a hard pill for you to swallow, can we just get you into humanism, like as a primer? Honestly. But I think we're almost out of time and we want to make sure that we give you the opportunity to plug your projects and your social media. Would you mind giving a shout out about what you'd like us to know and our listeners as well?
Okay, so you can find me on everything at Amber Akilla, mostly Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. And I have a podcast called Friend Crush with Amber Akilla, which is sort of like at the moment, the YouTube videos are also posted as audio. So YouTube is taking priority right now. And yeah, music and mixes I post on SoundCloud and Spotify. Yeah, stay hot and having fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, Amber. I'm so happy to have met you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Rose, do you have any last thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. Scroats die mad.
Have a good week, everybody.